Welcome back to the Zealous Podcast. I'm Rocky Snyder. This week, we've got Michael Watts. Now, Mike's a breathing expert. He's also performance director of Under Armour, but on his other times, what he does is he works with top-level athletes, partly from his days in Premier League when he was doing coaching over there, but he really works on getting proper breathing techniques established for better performance. And there's some simple tips that he's going to give that are going to improve your life, whether you're an athlete or just enjoying your day-to-day activities. Make sure you subscribe. Enjoy the episode. We're jumping right in. You know, in our industry, there are labels or titles because there are certificates that are doled out when you go and study and take exams, but it doesn't encapsulate the individual and what they do. And what I mean by that is that you're not a personal trainer necessarily, a strength conditioning specialist perhaps, but how would you describe yourself if we were at some gathering and somebody asked you, what do you do for a living?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think once you've been in the industry a long time, then you obviously gain knowledge, certificates, education, experience, and sometimes you can then take a pathway to be very, very focused and say, I'm going to specialize, or you can be a bit more of a generalist. I always probably say I have a master's degree in sport and exercise science, which is something that I was quite proud of in terms of doing, because that was a challenge to me to go and do. But in terms of like when people say, oh, what are you? I usually say I'm a human performance expert or human performance scientist, interested in the integrated athlete and looking at the big picture, the holistic picture of how an athlete performs and recovers.
So the complete athlete, how do you categorize, or what pieces of the pie create the whole athlete?
Yeah, so we look at a model to say there's obviously the performance element to any athlete. And if we looked at it as a pyramid, at the top of the pyramid is performance. And when we think about performance, we're thinking about how we can potentially make athletes stronger, faster, more endurance, more power, whatever it might be in terms of like those outputs. And traditionally, when we go and train an athlete, we sort of take them in the gym and we're thinking about how to put load on a bar, or thinking about how to make them run faster or make them more resilient just to be available. And then after sort of like traditionally, that's how I looked at performance. 12 years working in elite soccer, Premier League, national team level. It was very that way of thinking of, okay, we'll quantify things with data and then we'll do interventions that are based on the research, but we're just really focused on the 2-3 hours that the athlete spends in our care. We'll get them in the gym, we'll train them on the field, then they sort of go home. And the last 5 or 6 years, I started to explore different areas. And really it was back to what probably we would call health and wellness, like looking at the individual's body and mind and thinking, how do you assess and train the body and train the mind, and think about all those components that make a healthy and well human first and foremost. So we start thinking about how you move, how you think, how you breathe, potentially like how you sleep, how you eat, and just those basic fundamentals. Because I had this thought and this hypothesis of, if you can make somebody healthy and well, it's the foundation that they can go and flourish and do whatever they want to do, whether that be a pro athlete or just a general population, somebody who just wants to move better, be out of pain, whatever that might be. So we started to explore these different areas, and breathwork was a big thing to explore. And this was going back 6 years when it wasn't that mainstream, to be honest. And as we started to think about how we assess these different constructs of human performance, we started to find that many of the athletes that we were working with were deficient or had compensations in these areas. And they were almost achieving greatness despite of all these things going on. And I think if you go in a traditional program of performance, they don't look at these things because they're hard to quantify, they're hard to monitor, and they're really, really hard to change in a human. Like, it's much easier to get someone in a gym and get them to deadlift, squat, and bench, and get them to sprint. Like, super easy to quantify. And it's one of these things where you will get a very immediate gain, where you'll either visually see something or you'll see something in the numbers. And it's a safe place to live as a performance expert to say, I'll just sit in this lane. It's very safe. And there's so many other things going on that if performance nosedives or if injury occurs, I'm probably not under the microscope because there's other things going on.
Sure, you can shuffle the blame off to somebody else because this is what everyone else has been doing for so long. I'm continuing this knowledge and experience because I got it from this train of philosophy, this line of thought, and we're just continuing that all the way through.
Correct. And it's really interesting when you start looking at sport and athletes, and we have research, and the research is usually fairly controlled, and it will help us understand an adaptation, whether it be to strength or power or movement or breathing or whatever it might be. It's very, very rare that you will actually see the application of what was in the research in the real world, because people almost mash things together, rely a little bit on the experience. So most of the models being used, and I'd probably say, if not all of the models being used in pro sport, are based on research, but not directly the research, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Can you give an example roughly?
So if we were to talk about classic periodization, where we talk about taking an athlete through stability, endurance, and strength and power, and we think about the sets and reps that are used, and we think about all those other variables such as the rest, the frequency, time under tension, for example, which I know is a big one for you. We know that if we stick to those variables, for the majority, not all, you're going to get the desired adaptation, whatever that might be. But when you actually go into a weight room and you've got 30, 50, 60, 70, 80 athletes, it's impossible to make sure that every repetition is being done well, every repetition is being done at the right tempo, even the right load. Like, if we talk about the intensity of the load that's required to create an adaptation, or the velocity required to create an adaptation, yes, we can quantify it. There is technology that exists, but in real world application, it's near impossible unless you had multiple strength and conditioning coaches or multiple sports scientists. So we kind of take the science, mold it in the way we want to, and then apply it in our environment. And one big thing that I've started to believe as well is that we can almost make people better through addition by subtraction. And sometimes if we stop doing things with our athletes, we're actually going to help them, because we all want our piece of an athlete when they walk in the door, whether that be the masser, the strength and conditioning coach, the sports scientist, the nutritionist, the technical coach. And we're all taking a pound of flesh, so to speak, because we think we're doing the right thing. We're like, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But what I think we don't understand anymore is how strong is strong enough. If we've got a big, strong athlete and he's super strong, can bench and he can deadlift, is it right that we just keep making him stronger and stronger? Because how strong does he need to be? So instead of thinking, right, just keep working on strength work, keep pounding the weights on, because there's a cost to that. Everything we do is a cost. And it doesn't matter whether it's light session, heavy session, there's a cost. You are taking money out of the bank, so to speak. And I think the other part of this model now is to think, okay, so we need to think holistically or integrated in terms of what's going on with our athlete away from just the training room or the field. And we need to start thinking, is what we are doing adding value? to the individual, because the other thing we don't see a lot in pro sport is individualization. And we talk about it, but in reality, it doesn't happen because, again, it's very hard to do. So I think the performance industry is gathering momentum like it always has been. I know you've been in it a long, long time. And the parallel I'll give you is if you took more like athletic trainers or physiotherapists who are still within sport, and then you look at sports science and performance, you've seen a huge increase in the research, in the knowledge, in the industry within the performance space. But the physical ATs, more or less, they're doing the same thing because their knowledge base is really good, but it's sort of in one lane. So you've got sports science, performance doing this, and you've got more or less like rehabilitation on a par and on a level. But that doesn't mean to say just because we're learning more and knowing more, are we truly adding value? And when I first started in pro sport, there were no GPSs. Like we literally had heart rate. That's all we had. And we're in the age of GPS. And there's so many decisions now that are made on GPS, on the global positioning system. If anyone doesn't understand it, it's basically quantifying load within an athlete. And they're trying to look at certain variables to see if they're peaking or spiking, to say this athlete is not handling the load well enough. So if they're not, then we can make a decision to change training the next day. But for me, there's a huge gap from when that training finishes to the next training session starting, and we're making a decision based on what happened sort of 24 hours ago. So you can probably sense my, I don't want to say frustration, because it's an industry that's continuously developing, but I honestly believe there's a different way to achieve high performance and have your athletes winning championships, gold medals, whatever it might be. I believe there's a different way.
I wholeheartedly agree. We have been so biased to resistance training as the end all be all for the most part. I mean, time spent in the weight room under load. Yet there's so many other ingredients that come into the recipe for optimal sports performance or just optimal health and fitness for everyday life. And we have, of course, you look at the history of our industry. One, it's in its infancy compared to so many other movement-based approaches around the world, like yoga, that's 5,000 to 10,000 years old. Resistance training in gyms have only been around since 1870 or so, and even that has changed compared to what has really developed in the last 30 or 40 years since the 70s or 80s, and that has been premised basically or founded upon bodybuilding, which is aesthetics and not necessarily proper function or performance. And for that matter, we could throw in powerlifting or odd lifting, as it was once called, which is just gross force production of lifting something off the ground and then letting it go or putting it back down again. So yeah, it's hopefully we are at this point in history and time within our industry where we can see that there is other things to consider. There's when developing a program, and can we individualize it within a group format? Now that would be quite amazing. But I get what you say, where the purity of research is you add the element of chaos whenever you bring more people in with less and less supervision. So what are some of those missing ingredients? I know one on the top of your chart right now is of course breathing. What brought you into that path of research and really learning about the importance of respiration, proper respiration?
Yeah, so it was around 6 years ago when I met with Patrick McKeown, who's author of many books, but probably best known for Oxygen Advantage and also the Buteyko method. And I sat with Patrick it was just in a cafe downtown Portland, and we were talking about breathing, and he was taking me through a binder that was bigger than anything I'd seen, and just the amount of research in there talking about how efficient breathing or functional breathing was helping restore 3 pillars, and that would be the biomechanics, the biochemistry, and the psychophysiological side, in order to help improve somebody's health, wellness, and ultimately their performance. And at the time, it was one of these things where I was really intrigued by it, but nothing was happening in the industry at that point. That you go and speak to teams, athletes, no one was talking about breathing. It was much more in the yoga world. And we basically just looked at it and thought to ourselves, okay, there's definitely something here. The science is really good, but again, now it's that application side. And that's where we started to explore with different people and different athletes. Okay, if we're going to look at breathing efficiency, how do we measure it? Once we understand somebody's baseline or their score, how does that correlate maybe to other things? And for example, we saw a real strong correlation between a good breather had a better movement efficiency, or a poor breather had a poor movement efficiency. And we could see that in the data that we were collecting. And you sort of look at some studies now. That there's a study that was done with a functional movement screening, and they looked at breathing efficiency. And the outcome was that people who breathe better had a better score on the functional movement screening. And that research has been done. And you start to understand like the why, and you think about movement efficiency, you think about the core, you think about what muscles make up the core, whether it be multifidus, transverse abdominis, internal obliques, et cetera, and the diaphragm is in there. So the diaphragm is a key player within core stability, and a way to activate and strengthen the diaphragm correctly is through functional breathing. So then you start to think about these other connections, and then there's connections in the world of the psychophysiological component, so the brain and the body. And we know a lot of our athletes and a lot of our clients are very sympathetically driven and very stuck in that stressed state. So if we think about very high level, the autonomic nervous system and the 2 main branches, sympathetic, parasympathetic. We've got the sympathetic, which is our stress response, and then our parasympathetic, which is our relaxation. Most people, most athletes have many inputs that are stressful, physically or mentally, and can drive that sympathetic state. And it's good at certain times because it helps get us going and it helps us compete. But chronically, that becomes a bad thing. It starts to become too costly towards our brain and our body, and it can lead to some poor states of health and poor states of performance. So then we started looking at this research around if you can start to consciously control your breathing, and you can start to activate the vagus nerve, that 10th cranial nerve, then you can start to elicit more of a parasympathetic tone, release of acetylcholine, and you can start to change heart rate variability through breathing. Like amazing to do for recovery and amazing to help people on board in sleep. And then the big one, which is often overlooked in breathing physiology, is the gas exchange. And even in my master's degree in sport and exercise science and physiology, which are probably, sound pretty old now, probably that was maybe 12 or 13 years ago, maybe a bit longer. We always thought carbon dioxide was a waste gas, and that during exercise, we wanted to get rid of carbon dioxide because it was this waste gas. But the science was there, dating back to like early 1900s, that actually the presence of carbon dioxide helped with the exchange of oxygen into the cells and the tissue. And what we just find now is that if we have a high sensitivity to carbon dioxide, so when it builds up in the blood, we then go into mouth breathing because we're trying to get rid of CO2. And in order to get rid of that CO2, we'll mouth breathe to lower the CO2, and then the oxygen binds more to the hemoglobin. So it sticks basically and won't give itself up. So the name of the game really when it comes to breathing is having a higher tolerance to carbon dioxide. And that's like the basic fundamentals, and probably we'll go into how do you get there. But you see so many people and so many athletes that have a very high sensitivity to CO2. And if you think about people being stressed, a stressful mind leads to a dysfunctional breathing pattern, which is usually with the mouth. So if somebody's stressed, the mouth will probably hang open and they start to breathe out through the mouth. It becomes upper airways, the chest and the shoulders. So the diaphragm's not being activated, becomes a little bit faster. So that increases the heart rate, increases cortisol, increases the stress response, switches on the sympathetic side. And now all of a sudden, they're not getting as much oxygen to cells. And when you start looking at the science and the prevailing evidence that's coming out, it's not a new thing. And I think Patrick just did a really good job at looking at the work that was done and bringing that to light and bringing the evidence out there to say, people are not breathing functionally. People are dysfunctional, the chronic use, the overuse of the mouth, breathing too much air. And we need to get back to more functional breathing, which is basically with our nose.
Yeah, and this is one of those low-lying fruits that's really quite simple and easily accessible, not necessarily needing any specific equipment, and maybe a piece of tape to cover your mouth, as you had demonstrated in the Oregon State Clinic we were presenting at, which was fabulous. But it's very interesting that it requires a greater degree of effort to get people to buy in than the effort it takes to actually achieve results from a practice of breathing effectively and efficiently. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree, because breathing is something we all do and probably take for granted. I think we can take up to 20,000 breaths per day. So that is something where you think, well, I breathe, like breathing efficiency, like, is that really a thing? So there's that skepticism, I think, for sure. I think one of the things I first looked at was the list of benefits of breathing functionally. And as a scientist, you look at these list of benefits and you start thinking, and I'll go through a few, you start thinking, so I can improve my posture and stabilize my spine more. I can help with the first line of defense in terms of helping protect my body from maybe pathogens and viruses. I can circulate more blood and increase the oxygen to cells. Like these are big, big claims as a performance expert to an athlete. Is you can train really, really hard to try and get these benefits and get these responses. And it takes you a long time and a lot of effort. But consciously starting to think about your breathing can give you these benefits. But to your point there, Rocky, when we think about breathing, it's a real discipline, because we have to then bring a consciousness back to our breathing. Because if we fall into dysfunctional breathing patterns, either using the mouth too much, holding our breath without realizing it, which we would call an apnea. It could be a sleep apnea, which happens at night where you hold your breath. So it disturbs the quality of your sleep and affects your recovery. Or there's even a phenomenon now called email apnea, where people are holding their breath without even realizing it. And it all leads to this dysfunctional state. So the number one thing is I always like to do an assessment and understand somebody's baseline, but then it's just bringing a consciousness back to our breathing to think, okay, how should I breathe? And in what situation should I breathe like that? And what's the trigger to make me think about my breathing again? Because it's something most people don't even think about.
Okay, so let's go into that, because I'm curious. When the body is in a relaxed state, let's say we're halfway between sympathetic and parasympathetic, we're in that kind of zone where there's a balance between the two. And what kind of breathing would we want to have at that point? And then what type of breathing do we want to have when we're training, whether it be resistance training or otherwise?
So if we take the unconscious part of breathing, and let's say you and I are sat here and we're just in a relaxed state, not exerting too much effort and energy, you're probably looking at 12 to 18 breaths per minute, which is like a normal range for somebody. And if you're going to breathe in and out through your nose, it might be around, I don't know, 1,000 milliliters of air. So 12 breaths per minute, 1,000 milliliters air. You multiply that and it gives you your minute ventilation. So that's normal. What we see is that if people are dysfunctional in their breathing pattern and switch to their nose, they'll increase how many breaths a minute they take. but they might take in sort of less air in terms of the volume. But what ends up happening, their minute ventilation is higher, so they're less efficient. And the best way I always think about this is if you think about your AC unit at home, if it's not serviced and not functioning well, and you crank it up high, it's probably going to be noisy, and you're going to hear it a little bit, and it's probably going to shake a little bit. It's going to cost you more energy. It's going to cost you more money. Whereas if it's working well, you can probably turn it down and it functions well, and it gives you probably a better cooling system. And the breathing system's no different. Like, let's think about efficiency. So as we sit here, what we'd like to see is somebody breathing in and out through the nose. That ticks the big functional box. We want it to be light, as in, I can't hear you breathe, you can't hear me breathe. That's another sign of a functional breather. I don't want to see your chest moving, and I don't want to see your shoulders moving as you breathe. I want to see the expansion coming from the lower two ribs. And that's another big sign. And if we can do those three things, we can make it light, slow, and deep. We're hitting three big boxes of what we talk about in terms of functional breathing. You'll get all the benefits of the biomechanics, the biochemistry, and the psychophysiological just by doing those three things.
Fabulous. Okay. And with a certain type of cadence?
Yeah, so cadence breathing is used in order to control how many breaths per minute we take. So if you're looking for 6 breaths per minute, you're probably looking at a cadence of, could be something like 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, and there should always be a natural pause after the exhale. That's another functional trait. So in, out, pause. So just simply 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, natural pause. That's going to give you around 6 breaths per minute. There's also the ability to actually increase that parasympathetic tone by lengthening the exhale. And we start to look at this thing called resonance frequency. So every time we inhale, the heart rate increases, and every time we exhale, the heart rate decreases. So if we can elongate the exhale, we actually ramp up that parasympathetic side a little bit more. So then you might switch to, okay, I'm going to go 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, and then take my natural pause. You're still around that 6 breaths per minute. You've just elongated the exhale. There is a caveat to that, as with most things. If you have a very high sensitivity to carbon dioxide, and we talk about a BOLT score, which we might go into, which is less than 20 seconds, you may struggle to have a slow breathing rate, because as we slow our breathing rate down, and as we breathe in and out through our nose, carbon dioxide is going to build up in your blood. And your first stimulus to breathe is the buildup of CO2, not the need for oxygen. If you take a pulse oximeter, most of us have got enough oxygen in our blood. The problem is that when that CO2 builds, we go, I need to breathe. So if we can build your tolerance to CO2, then it's going to allow you to slow down your breath work, play around with your exhales, make them longer. And it's going to make you much more of an efficient breather. And then the big part as well, and we touched on it in terms of movement, is making sure that the diaphragm is working as we breathe. And the diaphragm is a muscle that sort of sits down in the rib cage, but it's attaching to the spine. And because of how the core is, if you've got tight hip flexors, for example, or your psoas is very tight, it's going to start to alter like the length and tension of your diaphragm, because we know that we're integrated, and as we move and breathe, it's all integrated. So simply thinking about getting your hips in that sort of normal lumbar curve, like not in that posterior tilt where your back's super flat, like that's not a normal curve. So you think, okay, I just swing the hips forward and backwards, get them in like a normal set position. And as I breathe in, I'll breathe slowly. I should feel my rib cage expanding 3-dimensionally from the back, the sides, and the front. And if I can visualize in my head where my sternum is, sort of the point where my diaphragm is, as I breathe in, that muscle will move down towards my navel. And as I breathe out, it will move back up. So if you breathe slowly, you'll probably see that your ribs expand, which is a good sign you're probably activating your diaphragm. And some people will use some visualization techniques of, I can think about my ribs expanding on an inhale, or I can just visualize the diaphragm drawing down and then moving back up again. And with any good muscle, it's the eccentric element or the time under tension that strengthens it. So if we think about a quick exhale, there's no time under tension. A slow exhale is going to place tension on the diaphragm and strengthen it. So it's important that we think about, just make it quiet, make it slow, so you can bring a tempo in, start with a 5-5, that's good, and then make it deep, getting that expansion of the rib cage and activation of the diaphragm.
And then how much do you encourage or maybe prohibit breath holding as a technique to improve respiration?
So I'm a big fan of breath holding. There's a time and a place for it. Again, if somebody has a very high sensitivity to carbon dioxide, when they hold their breath, carbon dioxide is going to build up quickly and they're going to want to breathe fast. So it can trigger a stress response or a panic state in somebody who can't tolerate CO2. So that's the first thing to think, where, okay, how do I involve this? But breath holding should be done on the exhale. That's where we see some people do it on the inhale, some people do it on the exhale.
Why is that? Why should it be done on the exhale rather than the inhale?
So if you take a breath hold on the exhale, we're breathing out, and then we're holding. It's allowing the buildup of CO2, and it's allowing something called nitric oxide to also build up in the nasal cavity. So like the nasal cavity is a spiral shape, and you can think of it as a shell. And if you ever look inside like a shell, you see those spirals, and we call those the turbines. And as we hold our breath on the exhale, this nitric oxide is starting to pool and build up. And then as we breathe it back in again, the nitric oxide dumps itself in the upper and lower airways, and it is a dilator. So you can see this nitric oxide as a vasodilator. The blood vessels are going to open up. So it's going to help in terms of delivering that red, rich oxygenated blood to the cells. But nitric oxide is also a sterilizer. And we spoke a little bit about the nose being the first line of defense. So if you think about the buildup of nitric oxide, I'm going to pull it in, it's going to sterilize as it works its way in, it's going to humidify, and then it's going to work back out again. So holding on the exhale is a good thing in terms of nitric oxide, but it's also a good thing in terms of helping that buildup of CO2.
And when is holding the breath too long? I mein, is there a spectrum or parameter and a window in which you would encourage people to go to?
Yeah, it depends who you are and what you're doing. Like there's big wave surfers, in your world of surfing, where you need to hold your breath for a longer period of time. So some of the surfers that I'd work with, they can hold their breath for minutes, like 5-6 minutes, but they're doing a different technique, because in a performance sense for a surfer, they're going to have to get rid of CO2 in order to be able to hold their breath, because if they can offload CO2, it's going to take them longer to have to breathe again. You think about that first stimulus to breathe. If we talk about just functional breathing and we talk about breath holding, if we can hold the breath on an exhale for a minimum of 30 seconds, that's where we'll start to see a splenic contraction. And you can think about the spleen as your blood bank. There's a lot of red blood cells that are held in that area. And as you hold your breath, as we hit 30 seconds, the thing will start to contract and release red blood cells. So we're trying to get people to 30 seconds and beyond. If you have the possibility to hold your breath for 60 seconds, 70 seconds, go ahead, that's fine. And then we talk about different breath holds. So we call them air hungers. You can have a light air hunger, a moderate air hunger, or strong air hunger. So if we're trying to get to the splenic contraction, the release of red blood cells, we're looking at a strong air hunger. So we're pushing it a little bit and it gets uncomfortable. The other thing that happens during a strong breath hold is that you'll see a drop in oxygen or drop in SpO2 in the blood. So oxygen will drop, so we become a little bit hypoxic. CO2 will increase, so we become a little bit hypercapnic. You can use breath holds, easy breath holds. So it might just be normal breath in, normal breath out, hold my breath for 3 to 5 seconds, and then go again. Take a few breaths, like maybe 3 or 4 breaths, and then hold again. That's very good also just to help calm the mind. And the reason is the brain uses up a lot of oxygen. I think at resting state could be like 20%. So as we hold our breath, we can actually start to deliver a little bit more oxygen to the brain as well. So I use breath holds for a number of different ways, from a health and wellness point of view to help somebody's mind. So I'll do easy breath holds. Or then from a performance point of view, then we're going into the strong breath hold work. But again, little caveat is if you don't have a good tolerance to CO2, you're not going to get near the strong breath holds.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the big wave surfing with breath holding, which makes me wonder, can we develop specific criteria programming with breath work based on the sports? For instance, triathletes, long distance endurance, highly aerobic athletes, are they going to want to perform different types of breath work compared to, say, a wrestler or a gymnast or rock climber? Do you have different criteria based on sports or what their aerobic capacity or anaerobic capacity is demanding?
Yeah, there's definitely nuances that you can get into once you get into different sports. Literally, the only sports we see that actually train the breathing is when someone is based in water, whether that be swimming, water polo, surfing, freediving. No other sports train in the respiratory system, although we are breathing, which sounds a bit counterintuitive. The first thing we have to do is restore functional breathing, and most land-based athletes don't have a functional breathing system, like they're quite dysfunctional. So we almost treat them the same as anybody in a way. What we find with the water-based athletes, they usually have a level of functional breathing. So we can accelerate their land-based or their dry land training. Because ultimately, for any athlete, we want to increase their tolerance to CO2. Because remember, if you've got a high ceiling, it's going to take you longer to have to take a breath. And if you're in a sport that requires you to hold your breath, diving, surfing, swimming, it's going to be much better for you. If you're in other sports, such as potentially wrestling or boxing, MMA, it's a different, you're not so much having to hold your breath. You want to just make sure that you're delivering a lot of oxygen towards the cells. And then if we get into something like an endurance sport, which is probably not as high intensity, we really, really want to make sure that 2 things happen. We deliver enough oxygen to the cells, but we want to make sure our diaphragm doesn't fatigue. Because when the diaphragm starts to fatigue, it's going to require blood, and the blood is going to move away from working tissue. So in the case of a cyclist or a runner, if they get into labored breathing, it becomes like heavy with the mouth. They're placing a lot of stress on their breathing mechanics. The diaphragm fatigues, requires blood, and the blood comes from the legs to feed the diaphragm. And that's where we start to see fatigue. So it's a little bit different for each sport, depending on what your requirements are. But the fundamentals are all the same, really, in terms of let's restore functional breathing and let's try and increase someone's tolerance to carbon dioxide.
I didn't really think about it, but breathing is like the canary in the coal mine, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a few fighters that I know and have spoke to. They will use that as a cue to know when their opponent is in trouble, either stress.
How so? When they start mouth breathing?
Yeah, when they start mouth breathing, because it's a sign of stress. Either it's a sign of physical or psychological stress. And as you start to become more aware of breathing, if someone starts to go to that mouth breathing, heavy breathing, you know that person's in trouble. Like, you know that they are starting to trying to consume more air because their body's requiring it. Mm-hmm. Another one you can start to see more at rest with people is if they sigh or yawn a lot, is another potential sign of a dysfunctional breathing state. So there's lots of observational things we can do either at rest or within sport to say, how is my opponent performing or how is they doing? If you're maybe a runner or a cyclist and you hear the person next to you breathing heavily, you know, that's a sign that that person is starting to reach their max or their ceiling in terms of their breathing efficiency. So it's one of those things that probably people don't be too aware of or think about. But yeah, it can be a good insight for you as an athlete to say, how is my opponent feeling? Because they could be on the start line and breathing heavily, which is just because they're stressed, or during the sport, they might start breathing heavily at a point where you're still under control of your own breathing.
So for the listening audience, that whether they train or aren't training, would doing something when they're sleeping be a great way to introduce breathing, like techniques or breath work, or just can we harness more of functional breathing during our sleeping hours, I guess?
Yeah, 100% we can. And a very sort of almost like a 3-step process, if you like, is prior to bedtime, whether it's before you go up to bed or while you're in bed, do that cadence breathing. Slow down your breathing rate and do a 5 in, 5 out natural pause, or a 4 in, 6 out natural pause. And just do it for as long as you can until either you forget or you fall asleep. And that's going to help shift you into that relaxation state, parasympathetic, and it's going to just help support and onboard you for sleep. During sleep, we don't want to be a mouth breather. So a very easy thing to do is tape the mouth. And it sounds a little bit invasive and it sounds quite scary to people, but it's something that can help promote nasal breathing. So you would literally take, and there's different tapes out there as well that you can work with, like Myo tape or Somnifix, or even just the 3M micropore tape. You would literally put a bit across your mouth and make sure the mouth stays closed. If you're someone who's got a small nose or small nostrils or deviated septum, you might want to sort of marry that up with a breathe right strip as well. And that way we can start to guarantee that you're going to use your nose to breathe. And if we use your nose to breathe, you're going to deliver more oxygen to the cells. You're going to probably have a slower heart rate. So you should get more restful sleep just by sort of doing that. However long you sleep, hopefully for an adult, it's between 7 and sort of 9 hours. You've then just taken a big chunk of your day where you've done functional breathing. And then once you wake up, hopefully the tape's still on, the nose strip's still on, take that off. And then I would say go into some very easy breath holds as you wake up, just to make sure the brain gets oxygenated and then sort of start your day. So it's like you can do all of that in bed, so to speak, consciously and unconsciously.
Well, I had a mentor some time ago who said, we can go without food for weeks on end, and we can go without water for several days. We can go without breathing for about 8 minutes before all things go bad. So it's so interesting that this is one of the most critical components in human existence. And yet here we are in 2022, just starting to scratch the surface. Now, granted, there's been other philosophies, approaches, movement modalities where, like you say, like yoga, the martial arts, a lot of the Eastern philosophies have been doing this for eons. But the Western, we're just a little slow to the take. But Mike, this has been great. Now, if people want to get more insights, more information about the style of work that you do, about breathing and so on, where would you direct them?
So I obviously have my own social channel, which is Flow2 Plus, FLO2 PLUS, Flow2 Plus. You can find me on Instagram, and I post a lot there on breathwork and breathing. If you sort of really want to dive deep into the oxygen advantage methodology, which is what I was educated on and I'm a master instructor for, have a look at the book by Patrick McKeown called The Oxygen Advantage, or The Breathing Cure, which is his latest one, which is really great. And then if you sort of want a more of an overview of breathing and the history of breathing, a book that made a big splash, I think it was last year, was Breathe by James Nestor. And he had a real deep dive into the history of breathing, to your point around how we were breathing hundreds of years ago to how we breathe now and what impact that's having on us as a species. So the 2 books are great resources. Oh yeah, please sort of follow me and reach out to me on Instagram for sure.
Perfect. Well, this has been great. I will be going out and getting some duct tape and breathe right strips immediately.
Thanks
for my
Rocky.
kids, at least. I don't know. We're already duct taping their mouths, so they'll be used to it. But thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on, Rocky. As always, it's great to speak to you, and I really enjoyed the chat.
Well, that's it for another episode of the Zealous Podcast. Mike Watts, just thanks to him for giving us some great insight on how to breathe properly. And be on the lookout in the future. I think Mike and I are going to do a couple things together, and we'll put it into a podcast form. In the meantime, have yourself a great week. We'll hopefully touch base next week, especially if you hit that subscribe button.